In 1931, uh, a mathematician named Kurt Gödel basically broke mathematics. He proved that no logical system can ever be, perfectly complete.
Right, which is just a wild thing to wrap your head around.
It really is.
Yeah.
Like, he proved that if you build a machine to calculate literally every truth in the universe, that machine will eventually print out a mathematically true statement that it is fundamentally incapable of proving.
Yeah, it's a total system-shattering concept.
But today, we are looking at a transcript that suggests ancient biblical figures, like Jesus and Paul, actually knew this exact same system-breaking secret thousands of years earlier.
Which is quite the claim, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. Welcome to the deep dive. You're here because, well, you're that person who loves the aha moments, right?
Right.
You want to grasp complex ideas from a totally fresh perspective.
Without just getting bogged down by information overload.
Exactly. You already know the basics of history and philosophy,
Yeah.
and you're looking for a new lens on something you might have thought was, fully mapped out.
Yeah.
And today's source material gives us exactly that.
It really does. It's a transcript of a fascinating, deeply philosophical conversation between a very curious user and an AI model.
We're going to explore this profound theory buried in their chat. It argues that ancient texts, specifically the biblical canon, don't just casually lack formal, systematic theology. They actively and deliberately resist it.
Yeah, and they do it using a structural concept identical to high-level 20th century mathematics.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to examine the premise that figures like Jesus and Paul weren't just bad at making organized lists of rules. They were intentionally constructing logical loops designed to break our systems from the inside out.
So to really understand how they break the system, we first have to look at an observation the user in our transcript makes right at the beginning.
Right.
The user points out the structural reality, which is that Jesus simply does not speak like a systematic theologian. I mean, when we engage with foundational thinkers, we usually expect architecture, right?
Yeah, we want the blueprint. We look for clear definitions, abstract principles, universal rules. We want to know exactly how all the pieces of the worldview fit together like an IKEA bookshelf.
Exactly. But the speech of Jesus operates entirely differently. It's prophetic, it's sapiential, and it's heavily performative.
He operates almost exclusively through parables and these highly provocative aphorisms. Instead of giving us a bulleted list on the ethical boundaries of the kingdom of God, he tells a story about a woman sweeping her dirt floor for a lost coin.
Right, or he says something intentionally jarring, like, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out.
Yeah, and he constantly answers direct, categorical questions with entirely different questions, which is so frustrating if you're looking for a straight answer.
Totally. And the transcript notes that systematic theology, as we understand it today, is an enterprise that emerged much later. It really started when the early church began wrestling with Greek philosophical categories.
They wanted to objectively define things, like the precise nature of the Trinity or the hypostatic union.
Right. But the ancient texts we actually have, they preserve a historical figure who consistently and actively disrupts those tidy categorizations.
Now, I was reading through this part of the transcript, and I immediately thought about the Apostle Paul. I mean, wait, what about Paul? He wrote the book of Romans.
That's a very fair point.
When you read Romans, you're just hit with massive, dense technical terms, like nomos for law, sarx for flesh. He constructs these incredibly elaborate arguments about justification.
It feels deeply architectural.
Right. Doesn't Paul represent the ultimate systematic theologian of the early movement? I mean, he seems like the guy building the system.
Well, the AI in our source material actually raises that exact counter argument. Paul certainly deploys what looks like systematic architecture on the surface.
He sets up those huge contrasts, right? Adam versus Christ, flesh versus spirit.
Yes, but the user provides a crucial reframing to the AI here. Paul is what historians call an occasional writer.
Meaning he is entirely driven of the specific occasion. He's not sitting in a vacuum composing a timeless summary of all divine knowledge.
Precisely. He is responding to localized, immediate crises. He's putting out fires, factional disputes in Corinth, legalistic controversies in Galatia.
So because his writing is an emergency response to a specific community, it's highly rhetorical. It's not strictly logical or comprehensively systematic.
Right. He uses heavy irony. He relies on intense emotional appeals. I mean, in Romans 9, he reaches a point of such anguish over his fellow Israelites that he wishes he himself were accursed and cut off from Christ for their sake.
Wow, yeah, that is not the calm, detached voice of a philosopher building a universal system.
Not at all. And the source notes that because he's writing rhetorically to specific fires, he leaves massive, glaring tensions completely unresolved.
Yeah, I noticed that. He'll argue that the law is holy and good, and then literally pages later describe that same law as a curse that brings death.
Exactly. He vehemently argues that human beings are not justified by works, but then he warns that everyone will ultimately be judged according to their works.
And he doesn't even attempt to smooth those contradictory edges into a consistent formula.
He just leaves the tension there. So, if neither Paul nor Jesus is trying to build a neat, comprehensive system, what exactly are they doing?
Are they just relying on pure mysticism? Are they just being paradoxical for the sake of sounding deep?
This is where the user in the transcript makes a massive conceptual leap. And here's where it gets really interesting. They suggest that Jesus and Paul are actually making Gödelian arguments against systematic theology.
Okay, I want to map out how Gödel shattered the math world, because the mechanism is vital for where this deep dive is going.
Let's do it.
So, in the early 20th century, the ultimate goal in mathematics was to prove that math was a perfect, closed system. The dream was to show that every true statement could be proven using the foundational axioms of mathematics itself.
They wanted a complete and consistent blueprint of reality.
Right. But Gödel essentially proved mathematically that any formal system powerful enough to do basic arithmetic cannot be both consistent and complete.
It's impossible.
Meaning, there will always be mathematically true statements within that system that the system itself is structurally incapable of proving.
He achieved this by demonstrating how a system tries to map itself and inevitably fails. It's a formal demonstration of the limits of a system, generated from within the system itself.
Now, the AI in our transcript initially misinterprets where the user is going with this connection, which I found super interesting.
Yeah, it's a classic AI misunderstanding.
The AI hears about the limits of language and systems applied to theology, and it assumes the user is talking about apophatic theology, that old medieval tradition of negative theology.
Right, texts like the cloud of unknowing.
Exactly, where the idea is that God is simply too vast for human categories, so we can only talk about what God is not, like a mystical surrender to the sheer mystery of the divine.
But the user firmly corrects the AI there. They clarify that Gödel wasn't throwing his hands up in a mystical shrug.
He didn't just look at numbers and say, oh, math is a beautiful mystery.
Exactly. He used a highly specific logical technique called diagonalization. The biblical texts aren't just saying God is mysterious. They are actively diagonalizing the conversations.
Let's break down the mechanism of diagonalization, because this is the concept that really unlocks the rest of the source material.
That's crucial.
Diagonalization is essentially when you construct a self-referential statement that the system cannot contain without breaking its own rules.
Right.
Think of it like a highly advanced camera programmed to take a picture of its entire environment, including its own internal sensor processing the image.
Oh, that's a great way to picture it.
The moment it tries to capture itself observing the room, it creates an infinite feedback loop that shatters the frame. Or, in formal logic, it's the classic liar's paradox. This statement is not provable.
Because if the system proves the statement is false, which means the system is inconsistent.
Yep.
But if the system cannot prove the statement, then the statement is true, which means the system is incomplete. It forces a logical short circuit.
And what the user in the transcript argues is that Jesus and Paul are deliberately constructing these exact self-referential loops in their dialogue.
They are forcing their listeners into that exact structural short circuit.
So how exactly do you execute a diagonal maneuver in an ancient conversation with a Roman or a Pharisee? Let's look at the specific examples from the text.
The transcript examines the well-known story of the rich young ruler from the Gospel of Mark. A wealthy man runs up to Jesus, kneels, and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?"
On the surface, it's a totally standard theological question. He's trying to place Jesus into a neat, systematic ethical category.
Right, the category of the good teacher who dispenses actionable, systematic data.
But Jesus responds by immediately diagonalizing the framework. He says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone."
It's a perfect logical trap.
Let's walk through the loop of what Jesus just did. If the young man accepts the premise that only God is good, then by calling Jesus good, he has inadvertently identified Jesus as God, which completely shatters his neat, transactional worldview.
And if he rejects the premise, if he argues that humans can achieve perfect goodness on their own, He is claiming a knowledge that stands outside and above the very theological framework he just appealed to.
The questioner becomes intellectually paralyzed. He can no longer stand outside the system to safely evaluate the data because the answer fundamentally implicates the questioner himself.
He is trapped inside the loop. He cannot stand outside to judge.
We see this exact mechanism again when Jesus turns to his own disciples and asks, "Who do you say that I am?"
Yes, because any answer they formulate will be a predicate about Jesus, an attempt to put him in a box.
But Jesus is the subject standing right in front of them, initiating the question. He structurally exceeds the category by being the one asking it.
And the transcript points out that Paul does this structurally as well. In Galatians 2:20, Paul writes, "I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me."
It's mind-bending. If you try to chart that on a graph of human identity, the system just breaks.
Look at how the subject, the I, is completely destabilized in that sentence. The I is simultaneously dead and alive.
Yet it's not actually the I that is living, but another subject living within it.
Exactly. Any consistent Aristotelian system of identity and non-contradiction just short circuits right there. Paul isn't just being poetic.
He's demonstrating that the reality of his spiritual experience cannot be captured by a complete and consistent logical system.
Which pushes the AI in the transcript to realize the ultimate logical conclusion of the user's argument.
The ultimate diagonal move isn't just a rhetorical trick Jesus used, or a paradoxical sentence Paul wrote.
No, the ultimate diagonal is the incarnation itself.
The very concept of the infinite, uncontainable God becoming a finite, historically bound human being.
The moment you attempt to place divine and human into stable, rigid, mutually exclusive categories, you've missed the reality of the incarnation.
Historically, early church councils tried to systematically define this union with phrases like, without confusion, without change, without division.
But as the transcript suggests, that complex formula is really just a symptom of a system trying to metabolize something that inherently defeats systematization.
The incarnation is the ultimate mathematical paradox wrapped in flesh. The reality itself diagonalizes any system that tries to contain it.
It's incredible.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a fascinating lens for the New Testament. But the source material proves this is a millennia-long pattern.
Yeah.
It's woven throughout the entire Hebrew Bible.
We can literally start at the very beginning in the book of Genesis with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I always assume the traditional reading here. God sets a rule, humans break the rule, humans are punished.
Right. A simple moral fable.
But the transcript frames the mechanism of the fall entirely differently. The fruit isn't forbidden because knowledge itself is inherently evil.
It's forbidden because the act of grasping for a systematic comprehension of good and evil actively ruptures relationship.
The serpent tempts Eve with the ultimate promise of a closed, complete system. You will be like God, knowing good and evil.
And the narrative itself functions as a diagonal trap for the reader. The reader observes Adam and Eve reaching for this comprehensive knowledge, knowing it will fail.
But the reader cannot stand outside the story to objectively judge Adam and Eve without simultaneously judging the inherent human drive to systematize.
A drive the reader is currently using to analyze the text itself.
It's brilliant. We see this resistance to categorization vividly with Moses as well. He encounters the burning bush. It's a fire that burns but does not consume the wood. It physically violates its own categorical nature.
And then Moses asks for God's name. He's asking for a definition, a handle, a category he can use to explain this entity systematically to the Israelites.
And God refuses to provide a static definition. The response, "I will be what I will be," is a pure self-referential statement without predication.
It actively resists being pinned down within a linguistic or theological system.
My absolute favorite example from the transcript is the story of King David and the prophet Nathan.
Oh, that's a perfect example of this.
David commits egregious sins, adultery, and murder. Nathan comes to confront him, but he doesn't bring a list of broken commandments. He doesn't offer a systematic moral critique.
No, he tells David a parable, a story about a rich man with many flocks who steals a poor man's only beloved sheep to feed a guest.
And David listens to this story and utilizes his systematic, objective, legal framework. He evaluates the data, applies the law, and furiously judges the rich man in the parable, declaring he deserves to die.
And then Nathan pulls the ultimate diagonal move. He looks at David and says, "You are the man."
That's a devastating structural trap.
Completely. David believed he was the judge sitting comfortably outside the system, objectively evaluating the moral data of a story.
But Nathan's punchline reveals that David is actually inside the judgment. His attempt to systematically judge the narrative is the very mechanism that condemns him. You just cannot be an external evaluator.
This performative exclusion of logic just escalates with the biblical prophets. The transcript points out how absurd their actions are if you view them through the lens of systematic instruction.
Yeah, Ezekiel is commanded to cook his food over dung. Hosea is told to marry a woman he knows will be unfaithful.
They aren't delivering clear propositional lessons. They become living, breathing paradoxes that resist being extracted into clean bullet points.
The source even mentions the calling of the prophet Isaiah. He is explicitly commanded to go preach to the people to make their hearts fat and their ears heavy and shut their eyes.
The divine message is explicitly designed not to be understood systematically by the listeners. The mechanism is intentionally absurd.
So, synthesizing all of this, the core argument of the transcript is profound. The biblical witness is not a messy source book from which we're supposed to carefully extract a neat, systematic theology.
No, it is a sustained, performative critique of the very enterprise of systematic theology, written across multiple genres and thousands of years.
But this leaves us with a massive existential question. If the text is fundamentally designed to break our logical systems, how are we supposed to engage with it at all?
Do we just give up? Does human intellect just dissolve into nihilism?
The transcript argues forcefully against that kind of intellectual surrender. And to explain how we are supposed to actually engage, the user introduces a surprisingly perfect analogy. The classic Eagles song, Take It to the Limit.
Which is such an unexpected reference.
I did not see an Eagles reference coming in a discussion about Gödel and ancient theology, but the mechanism works incredibly well.
It really does.
The song is all about the tension of pushing to the edge, the exhaustion of the cycle, and the drive to return. So what does this all mean for you?
Well, the expert in the text breaks this engagement down into three existential movements. The first movement is pushing.
Right.
This is the inherent necessary drive we all possess to comprehend, to categorize, and to systematize our reality.
When the rich young ruler asks, "What must I do?"
Right.
that impulse to seek a systematic answer isn't inherently evil.
It's absolutely necessary. If we don't attempt to build the system, if we don't try to understand, no genuine encounter can happen at all.
We have to try to build the blueprint. We have to map the territory. But then we inevitably reach the second movement, the limit.
The limit is where you hit the diagonal wall. It's the moment Jesus says, "Why do you call me good?" It's the burning bush.
It's the realization that the system has failed because it cannot absorb its own foundational truth.
You reach the absolute frontier of what your human categories can contain, and the system breaks under the weight of reality.
And this is where it gets crucial, because you don't just stop there. The third movement is the return.
You don't walk away when the system breaks. You go back and you try again. You take it to the limit one more time.
You see this endless cycle in the Psalms, right? Constantly oscillating between systematizing God's goodness, hitting the limit of profound suffering and feeling abandoned, and then returning to praise.
Exactly. What this cycle describes is a fundamental shift from objective knowledge to participatory knowledge.
The purpose of these texts isn't to dispense static data that you could observe safely through a microscope from a distance.
You have to be inside the narrative. You must be implicated in the parable, just like King David. To truly know in this framework is to participate in the cycle.
I really want to emphasize a clarification the transcript makes here. This process is not cheap mysticism.
Right. It's not an excuse to say, we can't truly know anything, so let's not think critically.
And it's also not cheap systematicity, where we arrogantly claim we figured out the precise rules of reality, now we can rest.
It is a rigorous, demanding, and often exhausting intellectual and spiritual discipline.
It requires the relentless work of approaching that limit, risking the inevitable failure of your own understanding, and having the resilience to return and build again.
It demands the weariness expressed in that Eagles song. Truth, in this sense, costs you something.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We took a deep analysis of a conversation between a human and an AI, and we mapped high-level 20th century mathematics onto ancient historical texts.
All to uncover a millennia-long structural resistance to systematic categorization.
Viewing these ancient texts through the lens of Gödel's incompleteness completely upends how we consume information. We're no longer searching for a perfect, closed blueprint.
We are actively looking for the moments where the blueprint catches fire,
It's a profound challenge to our modern, hyper-rational aspiration to perfectly comprehend and categorize every facet of existence.
It asks us to develop the capacity to tolerate and even embrace the breaking of our own internal systems.
Which leaves us with a critical thought to carry forward. As we wrap up this deep dive, consider this application.
Our entire modern technological trajectory, specifically the pursuit of artificial general intelligence, is based on a very specific premise.
Right, the premise that if we just feed enough perfectly categorized systematic data into a powerful enough model, we will achieve ultimate comprehension. We're trying to build a complete and consistent system of reality in code.
But if our oldest, most foundational texts and our highest mathematics are actively telling us that ultimate reality structurally resists systematization, we have to ask a difficult question.
Are we building our most advanced intelligence on a fundamentally flawed architectural premise?
If the deepest, most foundational truths of reality are structured to actively resist being captured by a complete and consistent system, then what does that mean for our modern lives?
Yeah. When you experience moments of deep, unresolved tension, contradiction, or confusion in your own life, when your personal system fails, maybe that isn't a failure of your understanding.
Maybe, just maybe, that's the exact moment you are brushing up against the diagonal.
Encountering a reality that is finally big enough to be true. Now that is something to chew on. A reality big enough to break the machine from the inside. Keep pushing to the limits of your own curiosity, everyone. Thanks for diving deep with us.